Hello, my friends. So today I'm going to be reading to you my most recent Substack article titled Iran's Cryptocracy is the Same as Ours. War Between the Right Hand and the Left. And I believe this is an important topic because a lot of people within our circles of the, sort of dissident right, conspiracy adjacent crowd online, they still perceive Iran as one of these rogue sovereign states that is standing alone against a sort of, Western hegemonic world order. And, Iran is this fundamentalist Islamic nation that is opposed to the globalists' ideology, opposed to globalist rule or Western rule. But when you really look closely at Iran, it's hard to believe that. The more you learn about Iran, the harder it is to believe that. And there's sort of two main reasons for that. The first, the reasoning that I think is the most important, involves looking at the history of Iranians' elite, looking at their biographies, looking at their genealogies, and really, putting a microscope to them and finding out where they came from, how they ruled, and where their power came from. But the other broad thing to consider is the ideology that is being pushed among the general population of Iran. And this ideology, despite the fact that the government, the ruling regime today, after the Islamic Revolution, is ostensibly fundamentalist Islamic, the fact is that underneath that, within the general populace, the same sort of ideology that is pushed in the West is being pushed in Iran. I mean, liberalism, despite the Islamic Revolution, liberalism in Iran is still going very strong. You can look into, how they've even allowed liberal democratic political parties to exist and, basically work as quote unquote loyal opposition parties within the Iranian government. They also have a strong women's rights movement, so to speak, a feminist movement in Iran, despite the fact that a lot of people in the sort of dissident right blame Islam for making Iran a backwards nation, taking them back to the Stone Age. They like to say that back in the 70s, Iran was this liberal and free place where women could go around. It was like a Western nation. And then the Islamic Revolution happened, and it took all that away. And this is, how terrible is Islam for this, and blah, 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 blah. But the fact is that feminism is still going strong in Iran. And they even allow women in their parliament. 6% of the Iranian parliament are women. Would a truly fundamentalist, backward Islamic regime allow that? I'm not sure if they would. And they even have their own versions of George Floyd going on over there, where they have popular demonstrations against so-called police brutality with, for example, the death of Masa Amini. So, they have a strong feminist movement, they have a strong liberalist movement, and they've even, they even went lockstep with the whole COVID-19 pandemic protocols that were being pushed by these international organizations that rule over the West right now. I mean, they even have Iranian pharmaceutical companies that are partially owned by international financiers like BlackRock and Vanguard, creating COVID vaccines to push onto their population, that were declared halal, basically, that were given the blessing by the Islamic church there. So there are quite a few reasons, just purely ideologically speaking, to sort of suspect, to get a little suspicious about whether or not Iran is truly this rogue, anti-New World Order sovereign state. But, like I said at the beginning, I think the strongest evidence, the strongest argument, is to look at the elites themselves. And that's what this article does. So we're going to be taking a microscope, like I said, to the elites and seeing if we can establish some pattern. But after we do that, of course, the biggest question is why? Why would, if Iran is truly controlled by the international elites, the same ones that control the West, the same ones that control Israel, why would they create this illusion that Iran is this rogue, sovereign, oppositional state? Well, at the very end, we're going to get into that. And we're going to get into what this sort of like faux sovereignty, this modern form of play-acting sovereignty, is meant to accomplish. So I hope you stick around to the end for that, because it's kind of a preview of the next article that I'm going to be publishing on my Substack, excuse me, where I'm going to get into that theory of why they keep up this facade of national sovereignty, even if they've totally captured a nation, and why they even promote ethno-nationalism within a nation for a time, only to later, strip that away and perform a controlled demolition on the dominant ethnos that was previously empowered by an ethno-nationalist ideology. So, yeah, I'll be giving a preview of that because my next Substack article is going to spend a good amount of time looking at that theory and looking at examples such as the British Empire, the USSR, the Ottoman Empire, America, of course, United States of America. But here we're going to look at how it applies to Iran in particular. So let me just begin reading my article here, and I hope you will enjoy. Iran's cryptocracy is the same as ours. War between the right hand and the left. Given the current war of the USA and Israel versus Iran, wouldn't it be weird to find Iran has been ruled by ultra-wealthy internationalist Jews and Western military intelligence for centuries? Let's begin by looking closely at the biographies and genealogies of Iran's rulers, beginning with the Islamic Ayatollahs, and then back in time through the Pahlavi and Qajar dynasties into the 1800s to see who built modern Iran. Then, once you can accept even the possibility that Iran is ruled by international powers rather than being its own genuinely sovereign state, let's consider why the international elites would retain the facade of an independent state and conduct wars that they manage on both sides. So the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Quote, Ayatollah Khomeini stepped off the plane from Paris and founded the Islamic Republic. End quote. From BBC News, 2011. Here's a clip from a document that was discovered by the BBC. In November 1963, Ayatollah Khomeini sent a message to the United States government through Haj Mirza Khalil Kameri, a professor of the theological faculty of Tehran University and an Iranian politician close to oppositionist religious groups. Khomeini explained that he was not opposed to American interests in Iran. On the contrary, he thought the American presence was necessary as a counterbalance to Soviet and possibly British influence. Khomeini also explained his belief in close cooperation between Islam and other world religions, particularly Christendom. Another quote. "It was previously known that Ruhollah Khomeini, the charismatic leader of the Iranian Revolution, had exchanged some messages with the U.S. through an intermediary while living in exile in Paris. But new documents seen by the BBC's Persian service show he went to great lengths to ensure the Americans would not jeopardize his plans to return to Iran, and even personally wrote to U.S. officials. The BBC's reporting suggests that the Carter administration took heed of Khomeini's pledges and, in effect, paved the way for his return by holding the Iranian army back from launching a military coup." The Guardian, 2016. Another quote. "I did not know it then. Perhaps I did not want to know. But it is clear to me now that the Americans wanted me out." Crown Prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Another newspaper clipping from Bob Woodward, Washington Post staff writer. "The Reagan administration's secret overtures and arms shipments to Iran are part of a 7-year-long pattern of covert Central Intelligence Agency operations, some dating back to the Carter administration, that were designed both to curry favor with the regime of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and support Iranian exiles who seek to overthrow it, according to informed sources." And here's another newspaper clipping. "Mahmoud Ahmadinejad revealed to have Jewish past." As a side note, it turns out that one of Iran's recent presidents, Ahmadinejad, was Jewish. Who would have thought? Put together all the quotes from above, and we learn that the Islamic Republic as a whole was established by a leader working with the CIA and U.S. military, this being confirmed even by the previous crown prince, and recent leaders like Ahmadinejad like to brag about being crypto-Jews. But maybe these are just limited or isolated events. Maybe the CIA only helped them this one time. Maybe the relationship was extremely limited. Worth noting here, too, is the fact that some researchers have made claims, published by Forbes magazine, that Khomeini was the son of a British agent for Anglo-Persian oil in Iran. This is not a confirmed fact, but the speculation shows how murky the background of the first Grand Ayatollah was, strengthening the possibility that he was a deployed agent himself. Another fun fact I found about the Islamic Republic history is that Ali Khamenei, the second Grand Ayatollah, just so happened to, quote, share a prison cell, end quote, with CIA/SAVAK agent Hussein Assadi. What a weird coincidence. But what if cryptocratic control over Iran began long before the Islamic Revolution? Let's now go back in time through the previous ruling dynasties of Iran to see if a pattern of Jewish/Western cryptocratic dominance will emerge, beginning with the Pahlavis. That's Crown Prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The final Pahlavi Shah was Mohammad Reza. He was educated at Williams College in Massachusetts, an elite school for Western blue bloods with plenty of military connections, and then shipped back to Iran to rule. After being ousted from Iran by the revolution, he moved to an estate just outside Langley so he could get cozy and work with the CIA. Quote, "Not only was it not surprising that Reza Pahlavi ended up in the Northern Virginia suburbs, it would be hard to imagine him going anywhere else. Ex-CIA agents in McLean began offering Shah Reza Pahlavi estates and farms as retreats in Northern Virginia as early as 1979, swearing they could spirit him past immigration officials at Dulles Airport. A major reason the younger Pahlavi moved to Grand Falls was political. Building his house some 10 minutes away from Langley, he was, according to his advisor and other observers, receiving a monthly CIA stipend. After a meeting with Bill Casey in Rabat, they began what Pahlavi called intelligence cooperation for mutual benefits. End quote. Although he denied that he took agency money, his financial advisor once claimed that Pahlavi's stipend sometimes rose to $150,000 per month. A large picture of him hung on the wall in Langley's Iran division, accompanied by the moniker, "The Hope of Democracy in Iran." Andrew Friedman published in the University of California Press. Here's his father, Mohammad Reza Shah I. Reza's relationship with the CIA was apparently inherited from his father, the previous Shah of Iran. His entire intelligence service, SAVAK, was essentially the Iranian arm of the CIA. Quote, a U.S. Army colonel working for the CIA was sent to Persia in September of 1953 to work with General Taimur Bakhtiar, who was appointed military governor of Tehran in December of 1953, and immediately began to assemble the nucleus of a new intelligence organization. The U.S. Army colonel worked closely with Bakhtiar and his subordinates, commanding the new intelligence organization and training its members in basic intelligence techniques, such as surveillance and interrogation methods, the use of intelligence networks, and organizational security. This organization was the first modern, effective intelligence service to operate in Persia. From the Encyclopedia Iranica. Providing that level of expertise and support never comes without so many strings attached that your country ends up a puppet. Additionally, he was ever the ally of Israel and was cast as a Western-style hegemonic civilizer in the region on Team USA/Israel against the Arab world in the Middle East. A pattern seems to be emerging. And here's his father, the first of the Pahlavi dynasty. Father of Reza was another Reza, Reza Khan Pahlavi. Quote, Reza Shah was the first Iranian monarch in 1400 years who paid respect to the Jews by praying in the synagogue when visiting the Jewish community of Isfahan, an act that boosted the self-esteem of the Iranian Jews and made Reza Shah their second most respected Iranian leader after Cyrus the Great. Reza Shah's reforms opened new occupations to Jews and allowed them to leave the ghetto. Another thing I didn't mention in this article, by the way, which I should have, is that this guy was explicitly installed by the British government. He was put into power, this is mainstream history, he was put into power by the Brits. Under the first Reza Shah, Jews in general were given more civil rights in Iran, including, importantly, allowing Jews to publish newspapers, and the abolition of their unclean status under Islamic law. Reza Shah is sold to us in mainstream history as a revolutionary against the failing Qajar dynasty. But in reality, it seems to have been a continuation under a different name, and it is basically uncontroversial to claim that the Qajars were run by a Jewish cryptocracy. For one, Reza Shah's daughter, Shahnaz, married Khosrow Jahabani, a Qajar prince. Numerous Qajar-descended aristocrats were promoted to the top ranks in the new regime, such as Amanullah Jahanbani, a direct descendant of the Qajar Shahs, who was made Minister of War under Reza. Just about every Qajar noble was able to retain titles and influence under the Pahlavis. The top leadership of the government bureaucracies of Iran were almost entirely retained post-Pahlavian revolution, and were staffed by the same officials as before. The last Qajar Shah, Ahmad, was not executed or even punished when he was overthrown. He was merely shipped off to live in an extravagant chateau in France, to live out his life in quiet retirement. All facts point to the Pahlavis being merely a continuation of the previous Qajarian regime. And what were the Qajars like? Well, like I said already, they were pawns of the Jewish international cryptocracy. Qajar dynasty. Quote, before Reza Shah Pahlavi, Qawams were Shah here in Iran. It's a quote from Michael E. Bonine in Modern Iran Dialectics, published by SUNY Press. Pictured above, Ahmad Qawam. Look at that face. Later member of the family and prime minister of Iran under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was also known as an agent for the British government in Iran, obviously acting as an agent for the globalist cryptocracy. The Qawam family descended from Haji Ibrahim Shirazi, the Jewish Grand Vizier of Iran, during the transition from the Zand dynasty, which preceded the Qajars, to the Qajar dynasty. Yes, it goes back even further than the Qajars, but I think we'll stop with them. Was a crypto-Jewish aristocratic family that was so wealthy and powerful that they were granted the honorific title of Qawam al-Sultaneh, the pillar of the kingdom, by the Qajar court. This family maintained continuous power in Iran from the Zand dynasty in the late 1700s up through the Pahlavis in the 20th century. During the reign of the Qajars/Qawams, the most amazing feats of Jewish economic plundering were undertaken in Iran. The Qajars, puppeteered by their Jewish Qawam masters, lived ridiculously lavish lifestyles and mismanaged the government to the point where they basically bankrupted Iran. They were then, out of desperation, justified, quote-unquote, in handing Jewish banker Paul Reuter the Reuter concession. In exchange for an upfront lump sum payment, Reuter would basically be handed total monopoly control over all of Iran's resources and economy. Quote, from Lord George Curzon, a contemporary of this event, the concession was dated July 25th, 1872. When published to the world, it was found to contain the most complete and extraordinary surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom into foreign hands that has probably ever been dreamed of, much less accomplished, in history. Exclusive of the clauses referring to railroads and tramways, which conferred an absolute monopoly of both those undertakings upon Baron de Reuter for the space of 70 years, the concession also handed over to him the exclusive working for the same period of all Persian mines, except those of gold, silver, and precious stones, the monopoly of the government forests, all uncultivated land being embraced under that designation, the exclusive construction of canals, qanats, and irrigation works of every description, the first refusal of a national bank, and of all future enterprises connected with the introduction of roads, telegraphs, mills, factories, workshops, and public works of every description, and a farm of the entire customs of the empire for a period of 25 years, from March 1st, 1874. My jaw dropped to the floor when I read that. Nasser el-Din, the Qajar Shah of Persia, basically handed a single Jewish banker the entire economy of Iran, out in the open, for all the world to see. The Jews back then definitely had bigger balls than they have today. Today, they're a lot more subtle about it. This complete and extraordinary surrender, as Curzon put it, was so absurdly unacceptable to the average Iranian that Nasser was forced to cancel the agreement. However, it was immediately followed up with other agreements that still gave Reuter total control over Iran's mines and, most importantly, the power to establish a central bank of Iran. That bank was known as the Imperial Bank of Persia, which became the monetary issuing authority in Iran, basically granting Reuter and his other financial backers, such as the Sassoons, known as the Rothschilds of the East, total control over Iran's entire economy. This bank is the direct predecessor of the current Bank Tejarat, the current central bank of Iran. Ultimately, this bank alone would give Reuter and his fellow elders of Zion the ability to exercise all the other means of control mentioned above in the original concession. It's important to stew for a moment on the extent of the aspirations and investment the Judeo-Cryptocracy had in Iran, as revealed by the Reuter concession. When Jewish bankers and Western experts finance and design the industrialization and modernization of a third world country, they embed themselves as the indispensable intelligence and infrastructure of the new system, creating long-term dependency. The recipient nation becomes reliant on foreign capital, which comes with high-interest debt, control over revenue-generating sectors like oil or infrastructure, and embedded advisory roles that shape policy behind the scenes. Since the systems, economic, legal, military, are foreign in design, only the international financial dark wizards and their minions fully understand and control them, effectively making the modernized state an operating subsidiary of the Jewish financiers. Debt repayment locks the country into cycles of borrowing with conditionality, while local elites, educated at Western universities, become internal enforcers of this neo-colonial structure. This kind of modernization does not produce sovereignty, but rather a durable form of indirect rule. Technocratic imperialism disguised as development. Furthermore, the local elites are literally brought into the family and become personally interwoven with the international elites via intermarriage and subsequent nepotism. At the very top of the political, financial, and industrial hierarchy, they're all cousins. Now, if we look forward from the time of the Qajars up to today, I think I've made the case that this pattern has been fully sustained, beginning with the Judeo-Western modernization and total capture of Iran's economy in the late 1800s, and up through today. They've kept control over their investment at every political step of the way. At the very top, it is almost certainly the case that Iran is a pawn of the same international powers that control the USA and Israel. Why, then, are they now staging a war between Iran and Israel? That will have to be answered in the next article. Thank you for reading. That's the end of this article, but like I said at the beginning, I am going to give you an explanation now for that final question. So let me just pull over something else I wrote by way of explanation. And this is kind of a general overview, but this will give you an idea of my theory. Iran's modern transformation was not a chaotic sequence of revolutions, but a meticulously executed multi-generational strategy by globalist elites to dismantle all native sources of power, tribal, ethnic, and national, and replace them with a homogenized, urbanized, and ideologically malleable population under permanent managerial control. The first phase of this plan began with the rise of Persian nationalism under the Pahlavi dynasty. Backed by Jewish capital and Western technical expertise, the Pahlavis were not independent modernizers, but intermediaries. Their role was to centralize power, suppress tribal confederations, and impose a unifying Persian identity that would erode older, more organic structures of loyalty, such as tribal allegiance, regional language, and religious diversity. Crucially, this phase also saw the acceleration of urbanization, not as a side effect, but as a central weapon. Millions were pushed or pulled from rural villages and tribal lands into centralized urban hubs like Tehran, where they became economically dependent on state-linked institutions and culturally cut off from their ancestral roots. And this is, like I said, I'll go into more detail in the article. But when you look at, like, it's not a controversial thing to say. This is like straight up on the Wikipedia page that Reza Shah was a modernizer who, where is it here? Sorry about this. His government carried out an extensive policy of Persianization, trying to create a single, united, and largely homogenous nation, similar to Mustafa's policy of Turkification in Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Something else I'll talk about in the next paper. Where is it? Here we go. His insistence on ethnic nationalism and cultural unitarism, along with forced detribalization and sedentarization, resulted in the suppression of several ethnic and social groups. Okay? This is mainstream history that says this. Once the old aristocracies and tribal networks had been sufficiently weakened, the global managers triggered phase 2, the Islamic Revolution. Okay. Oh, and let me say, by the way, too, interestingly, why did they choose the Persians to do this? When you look at a map of the ethnic makeup of the Middle East, Iran is an extremely diverse area. Okay, it's got more various ethnic groups than just about any other region, maybe except Afghanistan. But here you see the tan and the orange are Persian. The biggest cities were Persian, ethnically speaking. They were like, the horse to back in the region. They were the naturally predominant ethnic group of the region. But all these other ethnic groups, the Qashqais, the Khalij, the Turkmen, the Kurds, the Baluks, Pashtuns, even Armenians, Azeris, Qashqai, etc., they all had a pretty strong tribal ethnic identity, and they lived traditional lifestyles. They were essentially sovereign people. They were not ruled by any kind of foreign power, and they lived according to their own ethnic tribal ways of life. But the Persians were the predominant ones, so it seems like they kind of empowered the Persians to homogenize the region. They had to pick one, and the Persians were the natural choice. And you could see this too in the history, like, for example, Tabriz. See that little orange line there? In the middle of the homogeneous Azeri region, there's a little orange line to represent Persians in their biggest city. And that's because under this policy of Persianization in the region, they would deploy Persians into the big cities of these various ethnic tribes, these various ethnic regions, in order to administer over them. Okay, so it was, empowering one predominant ethnic group to create a mini empire here and to homogenize that mini empire in accordance with the globalist principles, the globalist aims. So once this goal was essentially accomplished, they trigger phase 2, the Islamic Revolution. At first glance, it appears to be a mass uprising against Western influence and secular tyranny, but in reality, it was a controlled demolition of the Persian ethno-nationalism. Okay? They start with Persian ethno-nationalism under these guys promoting Persian identity, promoting Persianization, promoting cultural unity under a Persian culture. But once they had sort of reached that limit, once they had expanded and done, once they've successfully sort of decapitated and disempowered the neighboring tribal hierarchies, this previous empowerment of the Persian ethnos as the dominant ethnos was now counterproductive to globalist aims and had to be like demolished in and of itself. So they had to do a controlled demolition of this ethno-nationalism. And with that came the Islamic Revolution. So it was a controlled demolition of Persian ethno-nationalism, which had outlived its usefulness and become a potential rival to global control. The revolution installed a Shia clerical regime, deeply hierarchical, ideologically transnational, and reliant on a new urbanized underclass that had no memory of tribal allegiance or Persian imperial pride. The clerics, many of them from non-Persian or borderland backgrounds, served as a perfect instrument. They crushed the remaining Persian elites, stigmatized pre-Islamic culture, and deepened the urban-rural divide. Urbanization now intensified as a tool of ideological conditioning. Cities became the nexus of religious indoctrination, economic surveillance, and dependency. Rural areas were depopulated or militarized, their youth absorbed into state-run universities, IRGC networks, that's the Iranian rebellion networks, or urban slums, anywhere but their ancestral homelands. In the current phase now, with Persian supremacy shattered and tribal resistance dissolved, the regime's grip persists through a careful balance of urban mass management and manufactured external threats, such as the conflict with Israel. These serve to unify the atomized population under a permanent state of mobilization, while the underlying cultural and ethnic substrate of Iran is hollowed out. The endgame is not simply authoritarianism, but a form of post-sovereign neo-colonialism, where no independent ethnos, class, or creed can ever again organize meaningful resistance. I think another part of what's going on as well is with the Islamic Revolution, the previous Persian upper class that potentially could have reignited an ethno-nationalist ideology, instead became exiles. They became scattered. So the best of the Persians that were the previous rulers, who were still in favor of ethno-nationalism, of like a Persian ethno-nationalist state, were scattered to the wind. They went in all directions, to Europe, to America, and that permanently deracinated them. That permanently removed their ability to recreate any kind of Persian ethno-nationalism in Iran. Like I said, a controlled demolition of the previous dominant ethnos. The entire nation is urbanized, ideologically anesthetized, and is socially primed to accept a Western-style liberal democratic regime. That may come in the form of a new secular regime propped up by the same international cryptocracy, or it might even ultimately be absorbed into an Israeli empire that overtly annexes the entire Middle East. It seems like Israel is the group now that is being sort of like empowered for this kind of ethnic hegemony in the Middle East. But, it's hard to predict the exact outcome. However, I would say the pattern, the theory here, goes as follows. 1, this is what I would consider the modus operandi of the international elites. 1, the international elites secretly, covertly, co-opt through financial influence, elite intermarriage, and propaganda the strongest ethnos or nation of a region. Then, 2, empowering the dominant ethnos with imperialist ideology and incentivizing full participation among the dominant ethnos in the imperial project with power, wealth, and privileges, the elites use the nation to aggressively advance their own agenda. This, conceals the elites as the true movers and shakers and creates a scapegoat that will later be despised. 3, the dominant ethnos reaches their limits of usefulness in the conquest of rival traditional or ethnic hierarchies with independent power, which became deracinated and disempowering the masses under the control of the dominant ethnos of the empire. That's kind of awkwardly worded. I'll have to reword that, but I think you kind of get it. The dominant ethnos reaches their limits. They've expanded as far as they could go, or even they're becoming too powerful. They're becoming too much of a threat. So they've conquered. The usefulness is in conquering rival traditional or ethnic hierarchies with their own independent powers, to deracinate all peripheral or rival groups in the region and disempower the masses under the control of the dominant ethnos of the empire. Then, 4, the quote-unquote oppressed masses get re-empowered. The defeated masses, these defeated, rivals, quote-unquote, that are disempowered, decapitated, emasculated, are then re-empowered after being deracinated under a new cryptocracy invented and controlled ideological movement. While the previous dominant ethnos, so simultaneous to this, the previous dominant ethnos is demoralized in various ways, with wars, financial collapses, demographic replacement, mass migration, propaganda, etc., finalizing the total control of the region by the globalist elite. Okay, so first they build up the dominant ethnos with ethno-nationalism, imperialism, etc. The dominant ethnos flattens the region, flattens the hierarchies of any competing or non-conforming, neighboring, or even not neighboring, but anywhere in the world, flattens hierarchies elsewhere. homogenizes regions. Okay, that's what, and in doing so, they're given privileges, they're given power, they're given big incentives as the dominant ethnos to conduct this campaign of imperialism, of homogenization, of destruction of these rival ethnic groups and nations around them. Okay? Once that is accomplished and these other groups are deracinated and destroyed, the other groups are then re-empowered under a new globalist-controlled ideology. It's no longer, since they've been deracinated, it's no longer their traditional or tribal hierarchies that are being re-empowered, but a new, like Marxism or liberalism, whatever, these new modernist elite-controlled ideologies are used to re-empower the previously quote-unquote oppressed masses, at the same time as the dominant ethnic group that was previously empowered with ethno-nationalism and imperialism is then demoralized in the various ways that I mentioned: wars, financial collapse, mass migration, blah, 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 blah. And then basically the oppressed masses are used to destroy with a controlled demolition that previous dominant ethnos in order to flatten everything, in order to flatten the entire state, so that these globalist internationalists can control them uniformly, finalizing the total control of the region by the globalist elite. This pattern has played out by modern empires time and time again for the last few hundred years. In general, this seems to have been the globalists' grand strategy for world domination. And in my next article on Substack, I will apply this model to a number of modern history's biggest empires. I believe this is the most rational and unambiguous explanation for the rise and fall of modern empires that I can conceive of. All other theories are far too dependent on ambiguous abstractions, as far as I'm concerned. Only this theory explains these imperial cycles systematically with a coherence and continuity between them that all other theories lack. So, that is what I will be exploring in my next Substack article. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll subscribe for the next one. If you haven't already, you can put a free subscription in on Substack, or if you want to support me, you like all the work that I've done, the work that I continue to do, I appreciate it if you do a paid subscription as well. Thank you everyone who has done that, and thank you to everyone who has just clicked like on the video or subscribed on YouTube or has been following me for any period of time or follows me on Twitter. Anything like that, I appreciate. You guys are the best, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you for watching.